Once again, we invite you to another exhilarating installment of Invincible Comics, where we explore the epic battles between the cosmos' most formidable beings. In this episode, we spotlight the confrontation between two indomitable forces, Conquest and Invincible. After the Invincible War, where evil counterparts of Invincible nearly reduced Earth to rubble, MarkGrayson finds himself in a state of desolation, aiding in the restoration efforts following the disastrous battle. Suddenly, Conquest, a battle-hardened Viltrumite, arrives to remind Mark of his Viltrumite duties. He warns Mark that if he refuses to aid in the planet's subjugation, he will be superseded and executed. Mark rebuffs him, leading Conquest to reveal that he was sent specifically because the Viltrum Empire expected his defiance. As they clash, creating a colossal shockwave, Conquest gains an advantage over Mark, slamming him through a building. He then taunts Mark with Anissa's words, a woman who had previously tried to convince Mark to let the Viltrumites take over Earth. Conquest admits his apathy towards the Viltrumites' plans, savoring the excitement of fighting an opponent as strong as Mark. Despite this, Mark channels his anger and frustration to hit Conquest, but it seems ineffective as Conquest smiles and praises Mark. Mark then launches himself at Conquest, causing him to crash through another building. After a brutal struggle, Mark finally manages to punch Conquest into orbit. As Conquest sends Mark flying towards the stratosphere, grinning, Mark tries to escape but fails. Conquest then decides to stop toying around and lands a punch on Mark, shattering one of his precious monocles. Mark plummets at a terrifying speed, receiving a thrashing from Conquest. He clutches his eye, which throbs with pain from Conquest's blow. Simultaneously, in another part of the city, Debbie and her boyfriend Paul are anxiously watching the escalating battle on the news. Oliver, Mark's half-brother, tries to help, but his efforts seem futile. The two superpowered individuals are moving too fast for him to keep up. Despite Mark's attempts to negotiate with Conquest, the Viltrumite refuses to stop, thoroughly enjoying the fight. Just when it seems like all hope is lost, Oliver launches a surprise attack on Conquest, briefly distracting him. Mark sees this as his chance to protect his younger brother and throws him out of the danger zone. But Conquest quickly recovers and pins Mark down with his elbow on his neck. In a desperate move, Mark headbutts Conquest, much to the villain's delight. Catching Mark's final punch, Conquest smirks and comments that if this is all the power he has, he's likely to perish. Meanwhile, beneath the Pentagon, Cecil hears about the battle and rushes to check if D.A. Sinclair has the 4 alternate Marks ready to be reanimated. But Sinclair tells him that their dense tissue prevents him from making the necessary incisions for the reanimation process. Cecil watches in horror, knowing that the world's fate hangs in the balance. "Then God help us all," he utters with a heavy heart. As Adam and Betsy Wilkins are glued to the TV watching the breaking news, they can't believe their eyes. The media has mistakenly identified Conquest as OmniMan, and the entire world is watching as the invincible superhero is being beaten by his adversary. But their shock turns into utter disbelief when Eve, who had been in a coma for 2 days, suddenly wakes up and sees the destruction on the screen. Eager to assist, Eve inadvertently reveals Mark's secret identity as Invincible. With a determined look in her eyes, she instructs a doctor to get in touch with Cecil and arrange for transportation to the battle site. In the meantime, Conquest was manhandling Mark, revealing that he had encountered Nolan in his younger years, indicating that he was significantly older than Nolan seemed. Just when it appeared that all was lost, Oliver reappeared unexpectedly, catching Conquest by surprise and aiding Mark to his feet. Oliver used Conquest's advanced age as leverage, hoping to shift the momentum of the battle. However, Conquest was not to be taken lightly, and he quickly brushed Mark aside to engage Oliver. In a shocking turn of events, Conquest landed a punch on Oliver so powerful that it knocked out several of his teeth and fractured his arm. The merciless villain then tried to tear him apart, but Mark stepped in at the last moment. At this point, Cecil's medical team arrived to transport Oliver to the hospital. As the battle raged on, Debbie was consumed with worry for Oliver's safety, but her boyfriend Paul did his best to reassure her. William, Rick, Amber Bennett, Gary, and Art could only watch in terror, as Mark was overpowered by Conquest's overwhelming strength and power. The confrontation between Conquest and Invincible escalated as they battled with raw power and incredible speed. Mark managed to land a powerful punch on Conquest, but the latter quickly recovered and sent him crashing into a destroyer ship. Just as Mark was struggling to regain his footing, Eve arrived on the scene, resolved to aid her friend. However, her presence only heightened Mark's worry. Knowing that Conquest was a formidable opponent, Conquest unleashed his fury on both Mark and Eve, breaking Mark's leg and impaling Eve. Mark cradled a dying Eve in his arms, his heart filled with sorrow and despair. But even in the face of such brutality, Mark refused to give up, and with all his might, he vowed that he wouldn't let Conquest survive. Conquest, however, saw Mark's compassion as a weakness and savored the fight, tasting the blood on his finger. Mark realized he was no match for Conquest's strength and speed, but his resolve to protect his loved ones drove him on. The two collided with such force that Mark fractured his forearm, while Conquest's cybernetic arm was destroyed. Amidst the chaos of the battle, Eve rose from her near-death state, her body regenerated and stronger than before. She unleashed a beam of energy that scorched much of Conquest's skin, and Mark seized the opportunity to hammer him relentlessly. With his body bruised and battered, Conquest makes a beeline for Eve, bent on ending her life. But Mark stands his ground, refusing to let him harm her. The three-way conflict escalates, each moment more harrowing than the last, with the destiny of the world teetering on the edge. As Mark lies on the ground, tormented by pain, Conquest looms over him, poised to deliver the death blow. But in a sudden surge of adrenaline-fueled anger, Mark headbutts Conquest, causing his face to contort from the impact. With his adversary momentarily disoriented, Mark seizes the opportunity to crawl towards Eve, who lies naked and unconscious on the ground. Holding her in his arms, Mark admits his love for Eve, tears cascading down his face. Just when he fears she's gone for good, a team of heroes from various comic universes arrives to whisk them to safety. Days later, Mark regains consciousness in a hospital bed, his body marred and bruised. Eve is by his side, relieved that he's back with her. During their emotional reunion, Eve confides in Mark that her powers can bypass the mental blocks installed in her brain by the government, provided she experiences enough trauma to unlock them. The revelation rocks Mark to his core, realizing the immense burden that Eve has been shouldering. From that day forward, he pledges to support her and stand by her side, regardless of the challenges they may encounter. Their conversation is interrupted by a loud knock on the hospital door. Debbie and Paul burst in, visibly shaken. Debbie breaks down in tears and implores Mark to renounce his superhero life. Mark struggles to respond as he still feels the intense pain of his injuries. Paul places his hand on Mark's shoulder and assures him that they will handle everything. As Debbie and Paul exit, Cecil enters the room. He solemnly asks Mark to talk, and Mark, still reeling from the emotional trauma, inquires about Conquest's whereabouts. Cecil reveals that Conquest is dead, and Mark stares in disbelief at the news. He grapples with the fact that he took another being's life even though it was in self-defense. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe and see you next time.